That's great.
I had a question really quick. I recently had a discussion with a Roman Catholic convert, and he was trying to challenge how we determine which texts actually comprise the canon, who come along and establish that. Obviously, he was making an argument that Rome had the authority to do that sort of thing.
Right.
My question is, and I actually gave Rich the wrong topic, so I'm sorry, Rich. My question is, concerning the Old Testament scriptures, how did the Jewish community determine what their canon was? By what authority, or what did they appeal to determine their canon and to say, here is our books, here is our Hebrew Bible?
Right. Rich says he forgives you. I just wanted you to know that. We don't want anyone carrying around a lot of guilt or anything like that.
It's that French courtesy.
Interestingly enough, even if we had gone with the oral versus written tradition topic, which is what I see on my screen here, would have come to the same thing because of what literally back in the 90s, and you don't sound like you were doing a lot of this stuff back in the 90s, but back in the 90s...
Born in the 90s, I'm sorry.
There you go, see? If you were listening to Catholic Answers and some St. Joseph's Communication and things like that, you would have heard them once in a while discussing what's called the white question. And the white question is a question that I developed on the fly, sitting on the side of a bed in a guest room in Massachusetts, doing a radio program with a convert to Roman Catholicism by the name of Jerry Matitix. And he and I had debated the Apocryphal books at Boston College the preceding weekend. And we had been told that the radio program we were supposed to do had been canceled. So we're driving around, we turn on the radio, there he is. And they're going, and we wonder where James White is. So we had been... I've always wondered really exactly how that happened. But anyway, so I called in. We started debating again, basically. And out of the blue, I came up with a question for Jerry Matitix, which eventually has become known as the white question. And what it does is it reverses exactly what you experienced. And what you experienced is what I've experienced and everyone else has ever experienced who deals with modern Roman Catholics. They go to the issue of the canon so that the unstated presuppositions that lie in the authority claims of Roman Catholicism can be more obscured, in essence. They can claim to have a kind of canonical authority without coming out and really explaining how that works, and how that works especially historically, in light of the fact that there is no dogmatic definition of the canon of Scripture from Rome's perspective until April of 1546. Now, they'll talk about what happened in the early councils like Carthage and things like that in the 4th century, but those were not ecumenical councils. Those were local councils. And so there is no dogmatic definition of the extent of the entire biblical canon within Roman Catholicism until I think it was April 18th, if I recall correctly. I need to check that date, but April of 1546 at the Council of Trent. And so the idea that they present to us is, well, if you don't have someone who can define for you what the books of Scripture are, then having inspired books is irrelevant because you don't know which ones are which. And so there is an assertion of a kind of canonical authority in the church that is not then backed up with any kind of argumentation. It's just a functional thing. It's like, well, nobody knew until the church told everybody. And it's playing on the ignorance of most Christians of the early church and of the whole process of canonization in history, what the nature of the canon is. When was the last time you actually heard a sermon on the subject of canonicity or the canon or things like that? It's not something that people really normally spend a whole lot of time thinking about. And so they can cover over the reality that there are differences between what Roman Catholic popes have said. There were popes that specifically clearly said the Deuterocanonical books were not, in fact, canonical. that they were not scripture, and that there had, in fact, all the way up to the time of Luther, Cardinal Jimenez, the man that interviewed Luther early on in the period of the Reformation, he had written an entire commentary on the Bible where he had rejected the canonicity of what we call the Apocrypha. And so there were competing views down through history, and they don't have to deal with that. They don't have to deal with the differences between earlier councils, local councils, and the Council of Trent in regards to some of the books in the Apocrypha and which ones are referred to by which names and so on and so forth. So it's very complex. And so the easiest thing for them to do is just throw the onus over on us and say, you prove a universal negative, basically. We're just going to assume that we have the authority to do these things. So the question that popped up, because Jerry and I had debated all this stuff at Boston College only a few days earlier, just out of the blue, I had not researched this. I was just probing for a way to be able to illustrate what the real issue is. I said to Jerry, Jerry, how did a believing Jewish man living 50 years before Christ know that Isaiah and 2 Chronicles were scripture? That's the white question. I asked him, how did the believing Jewish man living 50 years before Christ know that Isaiah and 2 Chronicles were scripture? Now, what this does is it forces the Roman Catholic to come clean with their presuppositions. Because if they say he couldn't, then there's all sorts of stuff in the New Testament that doesn't make any sense. Jesus holds men accountable for what's found in the scriptures. And there's no argumentation between Jesus and the Pharisees or even the Sadducees, because there are some people who would say the Sadducees had a limited canon. There's some evidence of that, but there's also contrary evidence, and so we're not certain exactly where everybody stood, and it might differ from Sadducee to Sadducee. So the point is, the New Testament does not give us any evidence whatsoever of a controversy in the first century in regards to what was and what was not scripture. Jesus held men accountable. He said in Matthew chapter 22, have you not read what God spoke to you saying? And then he quotes from the Pentateuch. And he's holding men living in his day accountable to what was written in scripture as if it had been spoken directly to them. So if you say they couldn't know, then Jesus' argumentation doesn't make any sense. But if they say he could know, how? If they say it was the infallible Jewish magisterium, the infallible Jewish magisterium never accepted the apocryphal books of Scripture. We know what books they laid up in the temple 200 years before Christ, and they did not include the apocryphal books, some of which were still being written at that time. So it is very plain that the Jewish people did not accept the books that Trent has now defined as Scripture 1,546 years later. So you can't go with that because the canon they defined is different than the canon that Rome has defined. So which infallible magisterium is the infallible magisterium, since they contradicted each other? So there's really no good answer. And so I asked this question, and now we're on the air on WMUZ? WEZE in Boston. WEZE in Boston. And if you know anything about radio, and I grew up doing radio, what you don't want is dead air, because it's true today. If what you're listening to on the radio on your car or something like that, all of a sudden it just goes dead, what's the first thing you do? You go looking for the station, and so you don't want dead air. And I asked the question, and we've got dead air. I mean, Jerry I could see it. I can see it in my mind's eye. He had never been asked that question before. And so there's a couple moments of silence, and then, of course, the host steps in and says, well, we're going to take a break, and we'll come back, continue talking about that. And so we did the commercial break, came back, and Jerry still did not have an answer, because there really isn't an answer. Now, over the years since then, I've heard people saying things like, well, the only way he could have known was to use the Urim and the Thummim on the breastplate of the high priest, which were basically the divine dice, and sort of go, Genesis, snake eyes, all right, you know? And I've literally heard people saying that's the only way you would have a mechanism of divine revelation to know the canon for people living prior to Christ under the Old Testament. It was the Urim and Thummim on the breastplate of the high priest. They came up with that. But the point is, there were no angelic visitations. There were no golden plates coming down from heaven. If you've heard about the Council of Jamnia, that's after the time of Christ, and they were not voting about canonization or anything like that. The reality was that the books that we have in what we call the Protestant canon, it's the Hebrew canon, it's sometimes counted as 22 or 24 books because the minor prophets were all in one book, and like Lamentations rolled up with Jeremiah, and it was sort of how it was put on scrolls. And it was basically tied to the letters of the alphabet, so 22, 24, depending on how you count those things too. But the canon that we have had been laid up in the temple 200 years before Christ. And so to touch those scrolls made your hands unclean because they were holy. And so those have been laid up. That had taken place. No angelic visitations, no councils, nothing like that. It was simply God working with his people. And what's interesting is it's pretty much the same process in the New Testament. You see, for example, it's called the Muratorian Fragment, about 185, 200, around in there. It has about 85% in the New Testament. Since it's a fragment, we don't know what else it might have been there, but it has about 85% of the New Testament listed at that. The Council of Nicaea takes place. The entire doctrine of the Trinity is being debated. Obviously, Scripture is right in the center of all of this. And no one's sitting there saying, well, we have some unwritten tradition from Peter that says so-and-so. No, that the basis of the debate, read Athanasius Contra Mundum. I'm sorry, Athanasius Contra Arianos, against the Arians. And he is making his argumentation from Scripture, not from some unwritten oral tradition or anything along those lines at all. He is doing it from Scripture. And so by the time you have his 39th Festal letter in 367, which is, he gives no indication he's going, okay, I'm going to create a canon here. No, he's dealing with the fact that people have asked questions about other books. And so he gives this list. He's not creating a canon. It's about the same time period you have between the Old and New Testaments. And it's pretty much the same process. No angelic visitations, no councils coming down from, and taking votes and all the rest of this kind of stuff. It's pretty much the same process going on there. And so the white question sort of exposes the fact that that Rome is assuming something that actually goes against Rome's conclusions. And so keep that in mind. You might be able to utilize that. If I could recommend the books by Dr. Michael Kruger to you, for the in-depth theological discussion of the nature of canon, because the key issue for us as non-Roman Catholics and non-Eastern Orthodox is to recognize that the canon is a theological reality before it's a historical reality. If we don't define what it is before we start looking for it in history, we'll always come up with erroneous conclusions. And so if you've seen Michael Kruger's books, grab them. If you haven't, then you might want to also look up the YouTube video from the G3 conference where Dr. Kruger and I discussed these very issues on the canon just a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago at most, at the G3 conference. And so that's sort of a 1 hour, here's what the canon is. It's theology, sort of starter kit, shall we say, from the G3 conference that might be very helpful as well.
I did have a chance to listen to that 1 hour segment there, and it was good. I also listened to another sermon that you had preached where you had mentioned that Scripture by its very nature is authoritative, and kind of how the New Testament was handed down, and by its very nature, we recognize its authority and it establishes itself in a sense. And so I just wanted to call and ask you that question. I had also had a chance to ask Michael Brown that question. It was over his YouTube live chat, and you guys gave very similar responses. It's kind of funny how that works out. So anyway, one more.